Hello, dear friends. Patrick here. We are finally finished in our coverage of The Collapse of Globalism by John Ralston, Saul. This is the last video I'll do on it, covering chapters 26 and 27, the last two chapters of the book. Chapter 26 talks about the normalization of irregular warfare, and again he talks about negative nationalism throughout. He tries to say that there's a lot of irregular warfare, like terrorist activity, that he says is due to negative nationalism. And he repeats that a number of times. You also have an interesting statistic that he gives on page 266. He says by 2003, the world was officially spending $1 trillion on arms, half of that coming from the United States. So a lot of money being spent on military expenditure. And he says that on page 268 that the globalization idea has not worked out because of these, dysfunctional nation states. And he says that negative nationalism is the cause of that. So that's been his recurring theme throughout the book. And then for the last chapter, chapter 27, he called it positive nationalism, which is kind of like a tongue-in-cheek title for the chapter, because he says there is nothing positive about nationalism. He says that there's only positive nationalism if globalism or communism wins in the end, right? Which he would call the inevitability of the economic prism. Is euphemism that he uses for the inevitability of communism. So he says that he starts again talking about negative nationalism, even though the title of the chapter is called Positive Nationalism. He doesn't give any examples of positive nationalism that he doesn't try and flip. He finally comes out and says his underlying theme for the book, right? He says many professional commentators and senior administrators in charge of economic questions tend to wrestle what is happening into their own terminology. This is on page 270. Thus, China is presented as the success story of globalization. You see what he says there on page 270? China are presented as success stories. He also mentions India, but he's basically pointing out that China is the success story of globalization, right? So there you see the motive of the writer all along, that he was trying to keep hidden from the reader. He was talking about how globalization is great and nation states are bad, and he kept pushing for this inevitability of the success of globalism, while all the time detailing and documenting how globalism is failing. So then he goes on, page 271, thus the conviction that one market view must prevail in all considerations, whether it be Marxist, is of little interest, right? He also mentions neoliberal, but he's basically admitting that he's a Marxist and he wants Marxism to prevail amongst him and his own true believer friends. He also takes a cherry-picked quote from Adam Smith out of context and tries to portray Adam Smith as being a Marxist himself, which is ridiculous. I don't know why he would do that, but he does that on page 271. And then he says another trend growing out of globalization's failure, right? The failure is that it provokes negative nationalism. So he says because globalization failed, you have this negative nationalism that has arisen, spending all this money on arms. Whereas since this book was published, we see the negative globalism instead. And we see the success of nation states standing up and saying, no, we're not going to stand for these globalist policies because the globalist policies are failing. The globalist policies are to increase corruption, to endorse radical, deviant ideologies upon the nation states so that their internal structures are thrown into chaos and civil unrest. This has been the technique of globalism, to try and destabilize the nation states so that the communists can come in and take over the country. And that hasn't worked. the people have pushed back and said, hey, you know what? These globalist policies aren't really helping us. We don't want to go along with this. And so many different countries are standing up and saying, we don't like these globalist policies. We want to opt out. And we would rather implement policies that are helpful for our citizens, that don't cause division, that are not racist, and that are not anti-economic, if you want to call it that. These globalization policies that have been implemented have been intended to destroy the economies of the nation states, and they've been unsuccessful. And so the nation states are standing up and pushing back, right? And he even admits here on page 273, he says, if we look at our own histories, we discover that the changes that have made the biggest differences have most often been local. Public education, obligatory school attendance, clean water, sewage treatment, laws on child labor, higher adult wages, all of this and more is fundamentally local, sometimes national. These are the foundations of middle-class well-being. So he admits that policies implemented at a national level end up being the most good for the citizens. And he calls the failure of communism to be this globalist crisis, right? And he says on page 274, again, he goes back to China. He says it's not just China that is aimed at balanced development in its own terms. So he elevates China as being this model for the success of globalism. But the efforts of the global elites to try and implement the same political and technocratic leadership that is happening in China, where the corporations under the umbrella of the Communist Party are succeeding in having economic success, he says that that should be duplicated throughout the world, and all his true believers are going to support that. It hasn't been adopted since then. And in fact, the efforts have gotten more radical since 2005, as we've seen. The efforts have gotten more bizarre in terms of what they're trying to get the nation states to do. And the efforts have ran into even more failure since 2005. So, you know, he says that there have been some success stories for globalism, and he mentions the Kyoto Protocol as one success story, which is, you know, getting the countries to agree that global warming is an important issue. And he says this might have been a success story for globalism, but beyond that, that's not much else. So he's concerned about the resurging nation states, he says. He's waiting. He says that the opportunity still remains, that they're waiting for someone to set the agenda for a new agenda. In other words, they're still, he mentions that on page 277, waiting for someone to set the agenda for a new direction. So again, he hints that the global elites and the world leaders are waiting for the one world government to take over so they can have a one world leader, right? They're waiting for the Antichrist to come in and take over. He says that in Europe, he says it will need, he said Europe needs 160 million immigrants by 2025 to keep its society functioning. So he says Europe is not going to survive. He writes this in 2005 unless they take in 160 million immigrants. Well, we can see what the massive influx of immigration has done since 2005 in a number of European locations, and they have not all been beneficial to the functioning of those societies. That's obvious to see. And he says there are those who believe immigration would undermine European culture. You think? Of course, the author says, oh, you know, that's not a possibility. You know, he even holds up Canada as an example of, oh yes, it's so great in Canada. Well, you know. And he also admits at page 278 that one of the things that the elites, the global elites, are hoping for as they usher in this one world government is a type of return to feudalism, right? He says those of us in the West will just have to learn to keep up and understand what makes such a major change positive for us. He says the beginning of major rebalancing of other countries, right? One of the ideas that has been growing for some time is that, growing for him and his elites, is that we are entering an era resembling the Middle Ages. And then he clarifies, says, the positive side of the Middle Ages. So he wants the global economy, this economic prison, to return to the Middle Ages, where you have an aristocracy, you have peasantry, right? You don't have middle class anymore. You just have the peasants, the ignorant peasants, and the aristocrats that rule over all the society. He says, if we're careful, we could move towards a system of intentional, on page 279, of intentional complexity, a euphemism for intentional chaos, right? That's what he wants to push. And of course, then at the bottom of 279, he says that Islam is fundamentally open and has a more flexible history than Christianity. And he gives a quote from the Quran, and he again quotes Adam Smith, that this is in the best public interest to have Islam as the global religion. So he finishes off with a paragraph where he says that communism and the one world government, right? He says, if people who know each other well serve the welfare of their fellow citizens, they may learn something unexpected about each other, perhaps how different they are. If people who do not know each other well, perhaps because they come from different cultures, serve the welfare of their fellow citizens, they may well discover how similar their values are. And this, he says, you know, if you bring in this communism, this one world government, then that would be an example of positive nationalism. That's how he ends the book. So it's quite a humorous turn on words that the author uses to finish the book by calling the chapter Positive Nationalism, because it is a argument for the it's an argument to try and get the reader to hope for the success of globalism and to hope for the failure of the nation states, which has obviously not happened. We still have nation states today. We haven't adopted a one world government yet, and the citizenry of the nation states are pushing back against the idea of a one world government. You can see that in Canada, the United States, even though the leadership of those countries have given themselves over to being true believers. The leadership of Canada and the United States, for example, are these true believers who believe that the one world government and communism is the only, the inevitability is the only option going forward. Whereas the citizens are saying, well, no, we don't really want to go under a one world government. We really don't want to go under the type of communism that is been victorious in China and is the most powerful force in the world today. We are trying to, the citizens are trying to maintain their independence. They're trying to maintain their freedom, which has become a bad word now in the media and in the public discourse, right? Anybody that mentions anything to do with freedom is frowned upon and saying, oh no, you're against the state. You're against the inevitability of the economic prism of Marxism and communism, which is going to take over the entire world so that they can bring in the Antichrist and achieve their version of utopia, where they'll be free to worship the state or worship atheism, or they will also tolerate Islam. And so those are the summations of the book. It was a painful, dreadful read to have to go through. I pity anybody that is forced to read this as a text for any type of college or university level course, which it may end up being, because he has had so many accolades. This guy, he's received honorary degrees from half a dozen Canadian law societies and universities and colleges across Canada, the United States. He's got honorary citizenships around the world. He's a member of the global elite, and his opinions are held in very, very high esteem. And yet he is promoting the destruction of individual freedom. So not only is he promoting the destruction of the autonomy of nation states in favor of a one world government, he is also promoting the destruction of individual freedoms. And so that's very unfortunate that most people that will read him will not be able to see through the smoke and mirrors, if you want to call it that. I mean, the book has been researched with a ton of historical information. I'd be very surprised if he did it all himself, if he didn't have a team of researchers to provide all this historical data that has been regurgitated and funneled into the book as a sort of a misdirection for the reader in his efforts to prop up support for globalism, and again to continually repeat how the any type of nationalist tendencies or desires or achievements of individual countries is seen as a negative. So there you go. It's a very painful read. I don't recommend it at all. I wasn't originally planning to make a series of videos for it. I was just going to briefly mention it in passing, but it's such a in-depth slog. It's very difficult to get through. It's like once you start getting into it, it's like quicksand. So then you get stuck, and then you got to get through it and finish it and read it, and pushing. Very, very difficult to get through. It's not an easy read, and so I hope that helps if you've had any interest in this topic. And again, it's dated. I don't know what he has produced since then. I'll have to go online and check if he's got any updated books that follow up on his work from 2005 or not. He must be getting up in age, so I think the world will breathe a sigh of relief from when he and his fellow elite globalist true believers finally leave this reality, and then they can go and realize how wrong they have been. What he faces in eternity is obviously between him and God. He doesn't believe in God, but that would be between them, and hopefully they can come to a meeting of the minds where his eyes would be opened and he may somehow make amends. I don't know if that's even possible from that side of eternity, but he'll find out, and if he can, we'll find out down the road, I suppose, too. So thank you very much for watching. God bless you. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're able to find some positive literature to read, some positive news to focus on instead of these kind of depressing and boring topics. I apologize. It is quite a boring topic. I'll try and find some more inspiring books to cover in the near future. I've got a stack from the thrift store that I'll have to go through and try and find something that is a little more lighthearted and uplifting in the future. So thanks again. I love you very much. I hope you're doing well. Spend time with people you love. Get some fresh air. Enjoy the weather. It's a little cloudy here today. But yeah, cheers. Have a coffee. Actually, maybe not. Have some water. Coffee's probably not that good for you. I got to quit coffee. We'll talk to you again real soon, okay? Be good. Take care of yourself. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.